What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Today I want to share a replication of a classic study with you. The original study, considered a classic in psychology, was conducted by Clark and Hatfield in 1989. You may have heard of this study, you may have heard of this experiment if you have ever taken an introductory social psychology class, for example. It's one of the old ones that is kind of spoken about a lot to illustrate gender or sex differences between men and women. Today we're going to look a little bit at that, and we're also going to look at a newer replication of that study, a replication by a researcher named Tori Conley from 2011. Looking at the original Clark and Hatfield study first, let me explain to you what exactly was going on here with this. What we're looking at is acceptance or the rejection of casual sexual offers. So researchers would ask, and this is the exact question that they asked, they would say, would you like to go to bed with me tonight? They would go up on campus to students on campus. They would find students that they were actually attracted to. It was one of the conditions of the study as well. So it wasn't even just random people, but they would find students that they were attracted to, and they would proposition them, basically. And a very large sex difference emerged between responses from men and women. 75% of men said that they would sleep with this stranger, this strange woman who just approached them. Women, on the other hand, none of them accepted the offer. And this is something that has been replicated. You can see a couple of resources there, a couple of citations on the slide. This is a finding that has been replicated a few different times recently as well. Basically, very few women, pretty much zero women, will accept a proposal for sex from a random stranger, while many men, often most men, will. So, looking at Clark and Hatfield here, how should we interpret this? Is this an expression of what has been called the libido gap? The libido gap being that men express greater sexual desire in general than women. And I think this is well supported, the idea of a libido gap, but it's also controversial. There are people that will argue against the existence of that. And actually this study will kind of touch on some of those arguments, perhaps some exceptions to the libido gap as well. Is it a sex difference in the willingness to engage in casual sex, basically? At first glance, it might appear so, but from the design of the study, we actually can't know that. And the reason for that is because there's a major confound. In fact, it's a double confound here. And that is that men and women are asking people of the opposite sex or the opposite gender, right? We don't see how they would respond to people of the same gender. And what that means is we don't know how much of the effect is actually explained by the asker or the askee, right? And again, in the original research, we also see that individual differences were never examined to explain it, right? Individual differences being, for example, personality traits like sociosexuality, like the willingness to engage in casual sex that are different. They vary differently between individuals, right? Because not everyone is going to respond exactly the same. But nonetheless, this is a study that typically had fairly good methodology. And one reason for that is related to what's called ecological validity, right? Ecological validity refers to basically the relevance of a study in the real world. How well does a measure on a test, right, or a survey or an experiment actually carry over to real world behavior? And when you have people running up to strangers in an actual environment on campus and saying, hey, will you have sex with me? And the people say yes or no, you can expect that that's pretty much going to be how people will react to you if you go out onto a campus and try to do the exact same thing. We're not generalizing, for example, from a survey to real life behavior. The real life behavior in this case was the experiment. So ecological validity, pretty good. It's good to do these kind of naturalistic experiments, so to speak, if you're able to do something like this. We see, actual people being approached in real life. Kind of has some implications perhaps for day game, right? In the pickup artist dating universe or whatever. People that are basically approaching many, many women a day. They go to a public park, right? This is for people that don't know what day game is. Pickup artists, men who try to seduce women basically, will go to someplace in public like a mall or a park and just approach every attractive woman that they see and try to start up a conversation or ask for a phone number and get a date. And in the original experiment, they did that as well. And it wasn't zero women that refused all male advances. So some implications here, and we can actually get into that more as we look further. So moving on now to the next slide. And the section here on the theoretical frameworks. We're going to look at the theories behind this that influence the selection of variables being tested in the replication. Risk perception theory, for example. This is essentially the difference in the way men and women are perceived insofar as risk is concerned. Men are perceived more threateningly. Men are scarier. Men are riskier, and this refers both to interpersonal interactions as well as relationships and sexual interactions. Men are perceived as more dangerous, right? Men are more dangerous physically. They're stronger. Most men can overpower most women, right? As well as social cues. We are taught, for example, that men are more dangerous and aggressive. That's a common narrative in society. So we see a confluence of social cues and biology that go together that may explain why men are perceived as more dangerous, more risky, more of a threat. And that's essentially risk perception theory. We're also going to be looking at this, or I should say the study looked at this through the lens of pleasure theory. And what is pleasure theory? Well, it's simple. It's the idea that pleasure is the main motivator or one of the main motivators of sex, right? Why do people have sex? Because it feels good. It's really that simple, guys. Pleasure in pleasure theory is evolved, right? It's an evolutionary mechanism that influences more sex, right? Why do human beings, compared to other animals, derive so much pleasure from sex? Because it's not a fact in the animal kingdom that all animals enjoy sex. Many animals don't. Many animals have sex as an instinct, but the sex itself, as far as we understand in these animals, is not done recreationally. It's not enjoyable. It's often painful, particularly for the female of that species. So human beings are kind of unique, and other primates as well, in that they've evolved recreational sex. They've evolved a desire to have sex for pleasure's sake by itself. And the sexual organs of human beings, particularly in women, for example, people say, what is the purpose of the clitoris, for example? It seems to be an organ that has evolved solely to produce pleasure. And if you can conceive children without actually experiencing pleasure, why do you need that? Why is that important? Things like pleasure theory describe that, right? Because the more pleasurable sex is, particularly for a woman, the more she's going to want to have sex. And the more incidences of sex, right? Every individual time you have sex, the likelihood of reproduction is higher. So over time, we see a selection for individuals who enjoy sex, right? Who have the biological mechanisms to enjoy sex, right? The organs evolve over time to experience intercourse in a more pleasurable way, and so on. There are some implications of pleasure theory. One of those is that women should actually reject offers from men more. Why is that? Men experience more pleasure from sex. This is something we see across the research, across different methods. The obvious manifestation of that would be in the orgasm gap, right? Men almost always orgasm during sex. Women, on the other hand, especially if you look at casual sex, orgasm about 10% of the time, right? So there's a huge gap between the way that men and women experience sex, especially casual sex. It's much more pleasurable for men than it is for women, right? And so this also informs us that women should be more likely to accept offers of sex, casual, short-term, long-term, whatever the case may be, from men who they perceive as more capable of giving pleasure. And these theories are important to understand because these are the theories that are going to be used to inform hypothesis generation and the tests of the hypotheses that come in this study, right? To explain why do women reject almost all proposals while men accept almost all proposals. And we're going to look at sexual strategies theory. Sexual strategies theory is, of course, a classic theory in evolutionary psychology, one of the theories of David Buss and his colleagues. And this is basically a lot to it, but let's go over it simply. Women make a greater investment in mate choice. They make a greater investment through pregnancy, through conception, through the raising of a child. It's more costly for women on almost every level than it is for men. And all the way down to the cellular level, right? Women have a limited amount of ova or eggs. Men have basically an unlimited amount of sperm. So at every level, from conception to raising a child, it's all more costly for women. Thus, women should be more selective in the mates that they choose than men are. And men, on the flip side, according to sexual strategies theory, should be less selective, right? Men should actually be trying to be as promiscuous as possible. They should be trying to spread their seed around, so to speak. Moving on to the next section. Now that we understand these theories, let's look at the current study, the current replication and the methodology that they used, as well as some limitations off the bat. So in the original study, as I've explained, many of you may already know, that the researchers ran up to strangers on campus that they wanted to actually have sex with, and they said, "Hey, would you have sex with me?" And of course, most of the men rejected. You can't do that today as easily, right? And that's what the author said in this paper anyway. I mentioned there have been some replications in the past, so perhaps this depends on the university and on the campus, and it may even be different because this was done in 2010. Now we're looking at 2022. Things may be even more strict now. But you have ethics committees now that you did not have in 1989 when the first study was conducted. Back in that day, you could do a lot of stuff you can't do now. Things like the Zimbardo prison experiment now, you can't replicate these things. Probably wouldn't replicate anyway if you tried, as far as what we know, but that's for another topic. It could even be a crime, right? It could be against major social taboos now, like the Me Too movement. It could be a crime, as they mentioned in the paper. It could be considered a form of illegal harassment. And now that we pay more attention to ethics now, and basically what impact our methodology can have on participants, especially unwitting participants in the study, we have to think about the emotional impact that it could have on them, the psychological impact. So if you run up to someone as an experimenter and you say, "Hey, will you have sex with me?" and they accept, and then you say, "No, I was just playing. I don't really want to have sex with you." Are they going to feel good about that? Is that going to damage them emotionally? These are things that might make this difficult to actually replicate now. So whatever, replicating the original study methodology wasn't possible for this researcher. So what did she do? She used surveys. She used multiple samples. She reran this experiment with different forms of surveys across different variations with multiple different samples as well. And we're going to be going over all of those. It's really a series of multiple studies here. She asked about the original hypothetical situation, right? And in a survey, you would present this and you say, "How likely are you to accept?" Okay, so instead of actually accepting, people are doing a self-report. And that comes with the limitations that self-reports have, of course. They looked at famous and attractive people. So this is an element of replication that is important, because replication isn't just about doing the exact same experiment the exact same way. It's about doing experiments with variations that account for things past experiments did not account for, and seeing if the result still comes out, right? It's about creating a better design or accounting for variables that old designs could not account for. And so that's what we're seeing, that despite the surveys, in my opinion, being a weaker methodology, we see a better methodology in the sense that they're able to account for other variables. She asked about the hypothetical, and then she can change the hypothetical and say, okay, well, what if we look at famous and attractive people? How likely are people willing to say that they would accept sex from someone who is famous or attractive? In a subsequent variation, study 3, she looked at friends, right? Actual friends people had. How willing are people to say that they would have casual sex with a friend being approached this way? And in the 4th variation, she looked at real propositions, right? So she's asking people, how many of you have been approached for casual sex? Then she's collecting a sample of those individuals and finding out how they rate the people that approached them, if they accepted or not. So we do see actually a real world measure here of people that actually were approached and either accepted or rejected casual sex. Overview of the methodology in the 4 studies and the variations that we're going to go over. Moving forward, let's look at those specifically and see what kind of results were generated. So, study 1, 4 variations here, A through D. Study 1, as I mentioned, this is going to be the hypothetical. And so here is the actual text used in the hypothetical survey situation given to participants. An attractive member of the opposite sex approaches you on campus and says, "I've been noticing you around campus and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight?" So that is one variable being accounted for, the yes or the no response to this. A series of tests or surveys were administered to measure personality traits as well. which was not done in the original study. So now we're looking at individual difference variables that will predict a response to this as well. Sexual capability. Remember pleasure theory, right? We expect sexual capability to have a role. Danger. How dangerous is the person? Remember the threat theory that I explained. Perceptions of mental illness. Does this person seem unstable? Perceptions of STDs. Does the person seem like they might have a disease? SST, right, or sexual selection theory, differences in gender. This was a large questionnaire of traits that would be predicted based on sexual selection theory. For example, is this person more or less willing to give a gift? And the final one is a measure of short-term relationship or sexual interest, right? Because some people are simply more willing to have casual sex. Some people are simply more willing to have short-term casual sexual relationships as well. When participants, men and women, responded to this hypothetical situation, we see that gender was the largest difference. And this is something that we see consistently throughout all of these studies. A little spoiler for you, gender was the most important predictor of the response. 82% of women rejected the proposal. 75% of men accepted. In the original study, 75% of men accepted. So we actually see the exact same number. In the original study, 0 women accepted. In this study, it looks like about 18% of women accepted. So more women were actually willing to suggest or to accept this scenario on paper than they were in person in the original study. Which is interesting because you might expect the opposite due to something like social desirability bias, right? Where people say what they think people want to hear on the test. And so people might act like they're less promiscuous in this scenario, especially women, but no. Women actually indicated in the hypothetical that they would be more willing to have sex. This could be the fact that it was about 30 years apart from the original study, right, about the end of the 80s. So differences could explain that, but we still see the same layout here, right, where the vast majority of women rejected, majority of men accepted. Men who proposed this sexual encounter to women were perceived more negatively by women. They were perceived as more dangerous. They were perceived as less likely to give sexual satisfaction. They were perceived as being more likely to have low status and being less warm as well. So these are all things that women associated with these proposers that they also tended to reject. And so the concept here that we're getting at from this first variation of the study number 1 is that women perceive, and men also, the characteristics of the other person differently. This is kind of an important hypothesis being developed throughout this paper, and that's that it's not just what is inside you as a man or woman that makes you more or less likely to accept a casual sexual proposal, but it also has to do with how you view the people of the other gender. Men view women more positively than women view men. And going forward with these studies, we're going to see more measures of that as well. Study 1B and 1C, they're pretty similar, so I'm going to condense these into one slide here. Remember, from the original study, I explained that gender was a double confound, right? So now what we're going to look at is how do men and women then respond to same-sex proposers? We're still looking at heterosexuals here, so you might expect that women would reject more women, right, because they're not gay, or that men would reject more men because they're not gay. But, was that the case? Well, we'll look in a minute. The point of this, though, is that if part of the difference is actually explained by the characteristics of the proposer, right, by how women view men, not just how women view casual sex, and vice versa, women should actually react to the way that men and women propose differently. So, moving on to the next slide, let's look at the results. Did that actually happen? And the answer is yes. Okay, so first off, men rejected same-sex proposals more, which is perhaps what you would expect from heterosexual men, right? Especially heterosexual men that accept most female sexual advances. They're not gay, so they're going to reject most men approaching them for casual sex. Great. But heterosexual women didn't. Heterosexual women rejected men and women the same. So there's a couple of explanations for that. First, we need to make sure or account for the possibility that this could be a floor effect. And a floor effect in statistics is when, due to your survey or your measure, whatever measure you're using, people tend to cluster at the bottom, right? And that makes the means look closer, and in the statistical test, they will be non-significant. So you'll say, they were the same. Well, they were the same because everyone answered a 0, basically. Something to consider, though, is that the female proposer in this case was viewed more positively than the male proposer. The female proposer was better in bed, right? She was seen as warmer. She was seen as higher status. She was seen as more likely to give gifts and as less dangerous. So everything that the male proposers were, basically the female proposers weren't. Women viewed other women much more favorably, even when being approached for casual sex by other women. Again, supporting this hypothesis being developed that the traits of the person approaching you associated with their sex or gender influence how you will respond to that casual sexual advance. Here's a quote from study 1B and C here, kind of summarizing what we see from the author. Even though agreeing to have sex with a woman would mean engaging in an encounter with someone to whom they are presumably unattracted physically, this was equally as unappealing as having sex with a man who approached them to propose casual sex. These findings show just how undesirable the male proposer is to female participants. Basically, women are, how should I put this exactly? Basically, women see it about as undesirable to have sex with a random man as they do to have sex with someone that they're not attracted to at all by sex, right? By their sexuality. Imagine a woman that you would have sex with as a heterosexual man as equally as a given gay man. That's basically how unattractive most men seem to women. And the final study in the series number 1 of studies, study 1D. This is a replication with bisexual women, right? So we're accounting for sexuality in this case. We looked at how women who are heterosexual respond to proposals from women. How do they respond to proposals from bisexual women? Well, they were twice as likely to accept the proposal from a woman as from a man. So, women who are presumably bisexual, right? Presumably have more or less an equal attraction to both genders, and that's not a guarantee, and we can't know that from this study, that they actually have an equal attraction to men and women despite being bisexual, because they could lean one way or the other. They were still twice as likely to accept the proposal from a woman. So a woman proposing another woman for casual sex who is bisexual, more appealing than that same proposal from a man. And that's consistent, again, with what we saw in the last slide, right? That even heterosexual women view the women proposing them for sex more positively. Moving on to study 2 series now. Quick additional theoretical framework we can look at here, right? Gustafsson, right? The theory of gendered risk. Women perceive men as riskier, similar to what was mentioned at the beginning of this video. Women perceive unknown men as riskier, right? Strange men are riskier than friends, right? Strange men are riskier than acquaintances or people even that you don't know but that you have seen around the neighborhood. These are all things tied up in that theory of gendered risk. So now we have to ask, okay, so would women be more likely to accept an offer from a proposer who is not a stranger? And this is where we begin to look at hypothetical situations with famous individuals, as well as hypothetical situations with opposite sex best friends. Looking at study 2A, the design here. This is where we're going to look at the famous people, and you can see some photos of the famous people being used here. These are not the actual photos used in the study, but they are photos from that time period. So this is more or less what those individuals would have looked like. They accounted for physical attractiveness here, guys. So we're looking at the interaction between physical attractiveness as well. In the male condition, we're looking at Angelina Jolie, Roseanne. They also added in Christine Brinkley, who is an older former model. Why did they do that? Because sexual strategies theory says men should care a lot about youth. So comparing Angela Jolie, who is much younger than Roseanne, not a fair comparison. Roseanne with Christine Brinkley, right? An older woman who's attractive versus an older woman who is less attractive. Better comparison. Okay, they're looking at Johnny Depp and Donald Trump. Remember, this is from 2010, so no one knew that Donald Trump was going to be the president. No one had strong political opinions on him. So political opinions, beliefs about Trump, one way or the other, would not have influenced the outcome. If people knew who he was, I guess it was the reality TV show guy or the rich real estate agent. I'm not exactly sure. He was famous, but I don't know how people would have mostly known him, except no one would have associated with him with Republicans or elections or anything controversial like we see today that would have influenced the outcome. Here's the scenario, the actual scenario that was given in Study 2A. You're fortunate enough to be able to spend your entire winter vacation in Los Angeles. Fortunate. One day, about a week into your stay, you decide to visit a trendy cafe in Malibu that overlooks the ocean. As you're sipping your drink, you look over and you notice that actor Johnny Depp is just a few tables away. You can hardly believe your eyes. Still more amazing, he catches your eye and then he approaches you. He says, "I've been noticing you and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight?" So, hypothetical situation, famous person, on a vacation in Malibu. Results for Study 2A right now. First off, okay, let's get it out of the way. Attractiveness mattered. And attractiveness was more important to men, right? All of the attractive people, Christine Brinkley, the older model, Angela Jolie, Johnny Depp, they were picked. And this is very important because attractiveness matters. And attractiveness matters if pleasure theory matters. So, big finding here from this hypothetical situation. The Clark and the Hatfield sex difference disappeared. Women were now just as equally likely to accept a proposal of casual sex from the attractive movie star, right? Or, yeah, I guess Johnny Depp, movie star. Men and women were also equally likely to say that it was appealing or that they would want to do it, right? Because they asked other questions as well. It wasn't just, would you do it? It was also, is this an appealing idea to you? Would you want to do it even if you're not going to do it? No gender differences across the board, guys. Very different from the original experiment and very different from what a lot of people would think about these casual proposals. Perhaps not entirely counterintuitive to many of you out there. You would say, of course, most people are going to sleep with a famous and highly attractive celebrity. But there you have it. Men and women seem to report a willingness to do that at about the same rate. What we see here as well is that women rejected Trump, right? The older, less attractive man. Men, on the other hand, accepted Brinkley, right? The older but more attractive woman. Both of these should be inconsistent with sexual strategies theory. Men shouldn't prefer Brinkley, right? They should prefer young, fertile women. And women, according to sexual strategies theory, should prefer a resource-providing man like Donald Trump. But no, we see basically that attractiveness overruled in both cases fertility and the ability to provide resources. Men, additionally, they would accept a stranger in the hypothetical scenario over Roseanne. They would also be just as likely to accept sex from an unknown stranger as from Angelina Jolie. So basically we're saying men are willing to accept sex from the unknown person or from the attractive person. Only when the person is clearly unattractive, they're going to say no. Women, kind of the opposite, right? Women were just as likely to reject an unknown proposer as they were to reject Trump. The only person that women accepted in these scenarios was Johnny Depp, right? The attractive, known movie star, high status guy. Moving on now, looking at study 2B, the design and the results. This is just a replication of 2A. They used a new sample. They used a new sample in a new geographical location, right? To see if the variation would change anything. They picked some new celebrities to use. They still kept Roseanne, but they used Jennifer Lopez. They got rid of Johnny Depp and Trump, and they put in Brad Pitt and Carrot Top. And they got, basically, it was pretty much the exact same results. I think they found a small difference with warmth or something. I didn't even put it in a slide. But basically, the exact same results. Carrot Top and the Strangers, rejected by women. J-Lo and the Strangers, accepted by men. Who got rejected, right? Roseanne, Carrot Top, and women rejected all of the Strangers. Here's a quote from study 2B that the author made, kind of explaining what is going on here. In sum, when women conceptualized the unknown proposer, They appeared to be thinking of someone like Carrot Top. When men conceptualized the unknown proposer, they appeared to be thinking of someone like Jennifer Lopez. This again goes back to the way that we perceive people of the other gender. Men typically perceive women much more positively. When we hear of a stranger in this scenario, we're optimistic, right? When women hear of a stranger in this scenario, they think it's Carrot Top. So, gender differences, not just inside, but in how you perceive members of the other sex. Moving on to study 2C. Let's see the design and the results here. We looked at celebs, right? And you might be thinking, okay, so there's some obvious confounds with celebrities and known person, because there's a lot more going on with just like, oh, it's not a stranger, right? Celebrities are attractive. At least the ones that were picked were. They're rich as well, and they're high status, kind of a unique situation. So looking at something with, again, a bit more, as I explained in the first slide, I think, a bit more ecological validity, right? Something that might actually be more able to be applied to your own life. And what we're looking at is proposition of sex from an opposite gender best friend in a hypothetical scenario. How likely were people to say that they would accept a casual sex proposer from their best friend of an opposite gender? This is asking a real question, right? It's asking people about an actual friend that they have, and do they want to have sex with their friend? Would they have sex with their friend if asked? So there were some gender differences in the perception of a friend, but not very many. People tended to view their friends pretty differently. Men were seen actually, in contrary to the way that strange men were seen, men were actually seen a little bit warmer than female friends, a little bit more likely to give gifts, but consistent with the past things, men were seen by their female friends as less likely to be sexually capable. Pay close attention to this variable of being sexually capable, because that's the pleasure theory variable, and that's going to become important in the studies that go on as well, and in this one in particular. Women were less likely to accept a casual sexual offer from their friend, as expected, but important here, this was until you accounted for the variable, which was the perceived ability to give sexual pleasure. As soon as you accounted for that variable, women were equally likely as men to accept a casual sexual proposal from their actual best friend. And this is consistent with pleasure theory, right? Women were just willing to accept a casual sexual proposal from a man who was not a stranger if they believed that the sex would be good, if they believed that the sex would be sexually satisfying. This is kind of in contrary to the idea that there's a big libido gap that is controlling most of this. Instead, these gender differences may be situational, and they may be influenced by two important variables. One, the men aren't strangers, right? The women are comfortable with these men. They're best friends. And two, the women are basically attracted to them. The women have the opinion of these men that if I have sex with him, the sex is going to be good. And looking at the last study, study 2D in the 2 series, right? They looked at gay men and gay women, again, replicating the same methodology. There was no difference between gay men and gay women in the willingness to accept a proposal from a stranger. This indicates that the effect is probably heterosexual and it is gendered, right? It's specific, in other words, to the way that heterosexual women view heterosexual men. Men wanting to have sex with men, they don't view other men that way. And women who want to have sex with women don't view other women that way either. Who views men more negatively and who views women a little bit more positively? Heterosexual men and women. Notable, most gay men and women also didn't accept this random offer of casual sex. And that's even despite gay men being the demographic that's most willing to actually have casual sex. Still, most didn't like it. And that's probably because most people don't just get approached for random casual sex. It's kind of a strange offer. As she described in the paper, she described it as a suspicion-arousing offer. There's probably some implications here for day game as well, as I mentioned, the pickup artist thing where men go into public and approach a bunch of women kind of shotgun style, as many as they can, and hope that one bites. A lot of those women are going to be scared and they're going to run away. And even though those aren't direct proposals at the moment for casual sex, it's kind of a strange situation. It's not the way most people are approached, and it's going to garner a lot of rejections in general. So moving on, let's see to study number 3 now. Here in study 3, we're actually looking at more individual traits, right? Individual differences, personality traits, and we're going to correlate them. We're going to look at them in a model with the responses to the casual sexual offer. So it's a replication of study 1 with a different sample. And again, we see the same effect. Gender, the largest predictor of saying yes or no. The second largest predictor of saying yes or no. Perceived sexual capabilities, right? What we discussed in the last study, or the second to the last study. People are more willing to say yes, particularly women, if they think the sex is going to be good. Simple as. Warmth was a small predictor. People who were perceived as more warm, men and women, more likely to get accepted. The belief that the proposer would be faithful was a predictor of acceptance by women. Interesting here, and if you guys have seen the video in Mate Switching Theory by David Buss, this might tie into that a little bit, but it's interesting that in this proposition for random casual sex, women would be more likely to say yes if they thought the random person propositioning them would be faithful to them. What does that tell us? It might actually tell us that what women look for in short-term mates, even casual sex, is actually very similar to what women look for in long-term mates. And that's something very consistent with the mate switching hypothesis, less consistent with the older dual mating strategy, which is something also I've covered that hasn't been able to replicate very well. So again, we kind of see the same trend here, right? That women are looking for traits in short-term sex partners that they would also like in a relationship. This is also support for sexual selection theory, where what is attractive to women on a sexual level is also what's going to be attractive to them for long-term mate selection. And just an additional mention, perception of danger and the perception of the likelihood of contracting an STD negatively predicted acceptance by women of the casual sexual offer, which is kind of intuitive. If the men seem dangerous, right, like they would hurt her, if the men seem like they were going to give her a disease, she's going to be more likely to decline the casual sex. Study number 4 now. Study number 4 is going to be the one that has the most ecological validity because we're looking at actual offers of casual sex, right? We're looking at people who had this happen to them, who were actually approached at one point in their lives for casual sex and either said yes or said no. So people reported on these past proposals of casual sex. These people would have been selected in a survey. Then the people who reported that that happened to them would be collected, and those would be your sample for the study from that point forward. Men who were approached accepted about 70% of the time. Remember, in the original study, 75% of men accepted the random proposal on campus. In the replication in study A, 75% of men accepted in the hypothetical condition. And again, we see that men who said, yes, this happened to me, 70% of them also said that they accepted. Women actually said that they had accepted 40%, which is substantially higher than the original experiment, that these women were proposed for casual sex and they actually accepted. This may be because they were unknown people and that sort of thing, so it may not be exactly the same, but it is a higher number than in the original study, and it's a little bit higher of a number than what women had reported in the experimental condition as well. Perceptions of the people that were rejected or that were accepted. Men were perceived as more dangerous. We see this consistently throughout all of these studies from the very beginning. Women perceive men as more dangerous. Women perceive men as more likely to have an STD. Women perceive men as being less sexually capable. Men, on the flip side, perceive women as being better in those situations, right? Less dangerous, less likely to have a disease, more sexually capable. What was the strongest predictor of sexual acceptance in these real situations? Why did people accept? The strongest predictor in this case was that the person seemed good at sex, which is consistent with the results from the past studies, right? People say yes to sex, casual sex, when they think it's going to be good sex. Pleasure theory, guys, supported consistently throughout these studies with different methodology. Gender, again, biggest predictor, right? Actually, larger predictor, as a matter of fact. Gender is the largest predictor throughout all of these, no question. But gender, again, men, more likely to accept. Okay, so we know that. We've seen that very, very consistently. And again, similar to past methodology, perception of an STD, very strong predictor, right, of rejection. So anything that's going to harm a woman, anything that makes a woman afraid or nervous, she's going to decline. That's her, she's going to leave. So scaring a woman, being a threat to her in some way, bad news, guys. Those are all of the studies. Let's kind of look at what kind of conclusions we can come to. Some final thoughts on what we have learned and kind of what is going on with all of these, right? From the original Clark and Hatfield research, many people interpreted this, and of course there's much debate on this because there were no measurements in the original study, but many people interpreted this to be a difference in men and women, right? Men and women accept sex differently because they are different. They didn't consider that men and women accept sex differently because they view each other differently. Big difference. And we see from this research that it matters, guys. The way women perceive men matters for these kinds of relationships. It's probably not just a desire in sexual, not just a gap, I should say, in sexual desire or in libido. That probably contributes to some extent because that is a thing that exists. But that's not all that is going on here. When they controlled for, the unknown person, for someone who was attractive, for someone who was able to give sexual pleasure, the gap disappeared. Women wanted to have sex just as much as men, right? So, women are sexual too, guys. Women want sex. They enjoy it. But it's got to be with someone that's going to give them pleasure. It's got to be with someone that they want to have sex with, and their standards are higher. Women were pretty much as willing to have sex with a hot guy, right? With the hot celebrity, with a friend that they were probably attracted to, and so on, as men were with a stranger. So women's standards are different. They may actually have the same amount of desire, but not for the same people that men do. Additionally, danger was a consistent negative predictor of willingness. STDs were a negative. There's an image, right, that women like the bad boy. And there's research that indicates in some senses this is true. For example, weak relationships with the dark triad and attractiveness or a number of sexual partners and things like that. But women don't typically perceive the aggressive man that they're with, right? The bad boy is someone that's going to harm them. If women think that they're in danger by an individual, especially by a stranger, right? If they think he's going to hurt them in some way, they're probably going to try to get out of that situation. Women are much more delicate physically than men. Most men can hurt women. And so they have to have evolved to be very acute to danger, right? To be afraid of men for social and biological reasons that are legit, that are real. Gendered risk theory, right? That's related to that, and that's what was supported here. Women consistently rejected men they saw as threats across different variables. And they similarly, or I should say conversely, women accepted men who they perceived as less threatening, right? Men that they knew that weren't strangers, as well as small relationship with warmth, right? People that were more warm. So status actually did not predict women's willingness to have casual sex. This was something that was interpreted as a problem by the author here for sexual strategies theory, where we should expect status to predict the willingness to engage in sex, right? And in the slides, I didn't go over a lot of the status measures because they had no relationships, and those would have been clustered with the SST, or the Sexual Strategies Theory questionnaire, and those were things like gift giving, perceived faithfulness. Some of those across some of these studies had inconsistent but small relationships, right? Perceived faithfulness was one. But typically, most of these sexual strategies theory or sexual selection theory measures didn't predict willingness or unwillingness to have this casual sexual encounter. But what did matter? Well, attractiveness mattered. We saw that in the interactions with attractiveness. And sexiness mattered. And we know from past research that these are two things that are actually related, right? Women, for example, are more likely to report orgasms when they view their partner as being more physically attractive. So these are two things that aren't independent. But we see here, attractiveness mattered. Sexiness mattered. Women were more likely to say yes to casual sex if they thought the sex was going to be good, if the person was attractive. Carrot tops, Donald Trumps, they say no to these less attractive individuals. Interestingly, pretty large number of people said that they would accept the casual sex proposition from their best friend, and if they believed that that best friend would give sexual pleasure, right? No gender difference. a surprisingly large number of women, as many as men, would say that they would accept it. So what does that mean? A lot of people probably want to have sex with their best friend is probably what it means. It probably actually comes down to that. And that would actually be consistent with, as I covered in a past video, mate switching theory, right? David Buss, mate switching theory, evolutionary psychology. And that's that people select friends with the same qualities that they want in mates. Why do they do that? Because friends are potential backup mates. People surround themselves with friends who, if they needed to, if something happened to their current partner, they die, they break up or whatever, they would have other potential partners there, kind of available, close to them, and so on. There's an implication here as well, I think, for the way people view female access to sex, right? And we see this a lot in Tinder and online dating discourse, discussions around this. People often say that women have this massive pool of men that they could draw from and pick from anytime, right? A woman can go on Tinder, even if she's just moderately attractive, and she can have a lot of matches. And if you were a man and that was you, and you had all of those matches, you might go through and actually have sex with all of those people. A woman probably wouldn't, right? And that's kind of what this research shows. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, and they have a hard time putting themselves kind of in the mentality or shoes of the typical, of the typical woman, that women don't think like men. There's big differences in the way that women and men think inside and the way that they perceive all of those other men. So a woman could have 100 matches and you could have 2 matches, but she might view the entirety of those 100 men as unattractive and not want to have sex with them, while you might view your 2 matches as like, oh yeah, they're passable. I'm a man. I'll totally have sex with them. They don't look like Roseanne. They're a little bit higher than Roseanne. So, whatever. They can pass. Women are much more selective, guys. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how incredibly undesirable most prospects for women are. So when you think about things, for example, in the manosphere, the idea of the CC, the cock carousel, right? The idea that because women can potentially have access to many men, that they will, probably inconsistent with how women actually behave, probably inconsistent with the psychology of women and the way that women view men. And if you look at, for example, sexual statistics, who is having sex with who, frequency of sex, so on, we see a pretty close 1-1 ratio between men and women. This is something I've written about and that I've researched in the GSS statistics in the past. I have an article up on that if that's something that interests you guys. But basically, women aren't having sex more than men are. Some people aren't going to believe it, but pretty much what all the research shows, and it's pretty much what this kind of research would be consistent with as well, and it says that women don't even want to have sex with a bunch of random men, like men want to have sex with a bunch of random women, seemingly. And I guess a final note, I mentioned this a couple of times throughout the video. There's probably some minor implications for day game, right? Day game, I've explained it. Men go up to strangers that they find attractive and try to game them, right? They try to get a phone number and get a date and so on. So it's an unnatural way to meet people. It's not a common way that people meet. And if you watch videos that aren't, kind of cherry picked and edited, you'll see these women like trying to run away. They're scared. They don't want to stop and talk to the strange man. And that's probably going to be most of your interactions if you run up to women and try to talk to them in public. If you do it 1,000 times, maybe someone will say yes eventually. But most people are probably gonna say no. If you're asking directly for casual sex, almost guaranteed they're all gonna say no. But even in the case that you're just asking for a date or something like that, which was also covered in the original study in this, but still, women tend to decline these kinds of proposals. So why is that? Probably because people are suspicious of it, because it's a strange thing to do. I'm not going to tell you guys you shouldn't do it or that you should do it. I'm not like a dating coach. I'm not going to tell you how to go out and get a woman or whatever. So whatever. But there's some implications. It's not totally unrelated to that. And it's something to consider that might be kind of a suspicion-inducing behavior. So video is done now. I'll make another for you guys very soon. I hope that you learned a lot here. If you like it, guys, remember, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll try to make another one for you guys very soon.